Hi, this set of videos is about connecting media research to the real world. And when you saw the title about reality, perhaps you were thinking about reality television, but that's not what we're going to be doing in the following videos. What we're going to be doing is thinking about methods for connecting the research that you do to things that are happening elsewhere, to things that are happening in society, and things that have been happening over a long period of time through particular histories in particular societies. And this is a way of doing two things. Firstly, it's going to cultivate an appreciation that media reality is reality. It's very important that we don't see media as things that are somehow detached from society, that we see media as being very much involved in how society works, how it's experienced, and how we see it. And that's what I mean by saying that media are the real world. You can't divorce the way that media occupy our time and encourage us to think about things in particular ways or allow us to express ourselves in particular ways. Um, you can't really think about those things without acknowledging that they are a part of our lived experience. So they're not something which is just about representation or just about entertainment or whatever it is. So, and particularly, we're going to be thinking about how, broadly speaking, feminist research has really been one of the very important places that have clarified what it means to say that media are the real world. And this is because there's a long tradition in feminist media research of connecting either representations of women or the way that women use media to the way that women live in the world, particularly in relation to how women are placed in the world by cultural customs, social customs, but also importantly, economics and social policy. One of the things that runs through a lot of feminist research is that you need to understand the way that either women are either represented in the media or the way that women engage with media in relation to I suppose, the boundaries that are built around them as members of the family and as workers in the economy and as citizens who are positioned in particular ways by social policy. So again, there's a very close connection between the way that women are shown in media, the way that women use media, and the way that women are um, or the way that societies and histories attempt to position women as subjects. And what that means is that when we're looking at images of women, we're asking a series of questions. And really, what we're trying to do is we're trying to put those images in some kind of larger historical and political context, such that we can use these images to understand how they speak to the way that real women were living in the real world at the time that these images were created. And what I've got in front of you are two images that seem to be very different, but I'm going to suggest in the following videos that they're actually variations on the same theme. So on the left is the cover from a 1970s romance novel from the very famous publisher Mills and Boon, where you see a woman being swept off her feet by this kind of 1970s James Bond kind of looking character. And then on the right, we see a cover from the contemporary era, and this is a cover from Chinese Vogue, Chinese Cosmopolitan, the edition of Cosmopolitan, which has specifically been made for the Chinese market, which has a very different representation of a woman. um, that seems to be doing something really different. There's no man in this cover, so we would say, well, this represents an image of a woman who doesn't depend on the good graces of a male partner for her success. But I want to think about ways in which these images can be connected. And in looking at the research of Janice Radway, who was writing about women romance readers in the 1980s, and Chen, I'll read from this week from Chen, who was talking about how, why, and how uh, glossy magazines with Western origins have become incredibly popular in what she calls post-socialist China. And I want to suggest there's a connection between the two of them. And what I want to suggest is that both reflect the way that women's media um, kind of also reflects the changing social and economic position of women in different places and different times. So, what we're going to do is look at a few questions and think about why is it that different cultures at different places and different times have different images of women? What motivates those changes? We're going to also be asking the question of how women use these images to manage their lives, to make sense of the social circumstances, and particularly the economic circumstances in which they find themselves. And then also, I'm going to be suggesting that looking at Chen's research on Chinese women's magazines is a really useful way of thinking about images, how images can teach us about society and history. And there's a methodological aspect to that as well, because in considering how and why Chen has selected the images and the media text that she has to write her research on the history of women's representations in China, we can learn a few handy methodological tips about how to practice case study methods. And I'm going to suggest that Chen's is an example of how we can further general knowledge about the media's role in society by picking what we might call extreme cases. That is, very unusual case studies which are representative in the sense that they allow us to examine the outer limits of media theory. In this sense, we're going to be talking about how Radway Radway's work was really, really important, but also reflected the concerns of a very particular political context, which does not operate in the same way. Well, it's a very different political context in China, where some of the similar themes, stories about women's self fulfillment, success, and also consumption, work in a very, very different context. So Chen allows us to ask what happens when we take a series of theories that have been made about media content in one place and time and transfer them to another. And this is really helpful for your research because it helps us sensitize us to ways to go about explaining why we are studying the things that we are studying. So that's the broad map. We're going to be looking at changing representations of women, thinking about that as a way of making our research more interesting by giving it some political and historical context. And then also thinking about how we can make our work representative in a broad way by thinking about how we can define what we're doing in terms of general theoretical suppositions.